At 7:30 on the morning of July 4, 1946, as the sun rose over the scarred earth of postwar Poland, a young woman with bound hands stepped onto a wooden platform and faced the end of her life. And in that quiet moment, with the noose waiting inches from her throat, the world was forced to confront a truth far more unsettling than her death itself. Because this woman had not been dragged to evil by accident or fear or desperation, she had walked toward it willingly, smiling as she went, and her name was Elsa Ehrich, known to her victims as the Beast, the Blonde Devil, the woman who beat children to death in front of their mothers and laughed while doing it. And as her legs trembled on the gallows, the people gathered below did not see a frightened prisoner, they saw the embodiment of a system that had turned cruelty into routine and murder into a job description, and they remembered her as she truly was, standing years earlier in the dust and smoke of Majdanek concentration camp, whip in hand, selecting who would live a few more weeks and who would die before nightfall. Because this story does not begin with her execution, it begins years earlier, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, in a place the Nazis themselves openly called a death camp, a place built so brazenly that the citizens of Lublin could see it from their windows and smell it when the wind shifted. A place where screams carried across fields and ashes settled silently onto nearby homes, and in 1943 inside that camp, a Polish doctor named Stefania Perzanowska made a promise that would echo through history, a promise born not from hope but from rage and survival, because when she approached Elsa Ehrich with a simple request for milk for starving children, Ehrich did not hesitate. She slapped the doctor across the face and screamed, "This is not a sanatorium, this is a death camp." And in that sentence was the full truth of who she was and what she believed, because she knew exactly where she was and what her role was meant to be, and Perzanowska, humiliated and beaten, swore that if she lived, the world would know what these women did, not just the men, because inside Majdanek, the cruelty was not limited by gender, and sometimes, as survivors would later testify, the women were worse, and Majdanek itself was a monument to that cruelty, established in 1941 on the outskirts of Lublin. First as a forced labor camp for Soviet prisoners of war, and then rapidly transformed into a core component of the Nazi extermination machine, where Jews, Poles, and countless others were murdered through gas chambers, shootings, starvation, disease, and relentless abuse. And between 1941 and 1944, nearly 80,000 people were killed there, not hidden away in forests but in plain sight, as if the SS believed the war would end before anyone could ever demand accountability. And among the 1,300 guards stationed at Majdanek were 28 women, trained at Ravensbrück to believe that prisoners were subhuman and mercy was betrayal. And when Elsa Ehrich arrived in April 1943 at the age of 27, she did not arrive reluctantly or under threat. She volunteered, unmarried, ambitious, eager for the pay, housing, and authority the uniform provided, and within months she became one of the most feared figures in the women's section. Known for carrying a whip she used constantly, on women, on children, on anyone who displeased her, and especially for her role in selections, those moments when transports arrived and human lives were reduced to gestures, left for labor, right for death, decisions she made casually, sometimes laughing, sometimes mocking mothers who clung to their children, tearing families apart with her own hands, because witnesses would later say she did not act like someone obeying orders, she acted like someone enjoying herself, and this enjoyment was not imagined. It was described again and again in testimonies: her smile during beatings, her laughter during selections, her habit of mocking the dying, and this was not the portrait of a woman forced into evil but of someone who found in the camp an excuse to indulge impulses that ordinary life had never allowed. Because before the war, Elsa Ehrich was unremarkable, born in 1916 in a small German fishing town, the daughter of a fisherman, educated only briefly, working as a domestic servant and factory laborer, a working-class woman with limited prospects, and when she answered a recruitment advertisement for female concentration camp guards in 1942, she found not just a job but an identity, and at Ravensbrück, where many recruits broke down or requested transfers, Ehrich thrived, praised for her enthusiasm and willingness to punish, showing no hesitation, no doubt, no empathy, fully absorbing the ideology that told her these people deserved their fate, and yet, as survivors like Dr. Przanowska would later observe. Ideology alone did not explain her behavior, because others beat prisoners when ordered to, but Kochman beat them because she wanted to, and the most damning evidence of this desire came not from documents or official reports but from what she did to children, from the summer of 1943 onward, when transports of Jewish families arrived and she was tasked with separating mothers from sons and daughters, babies from arms, futures from hope, and witnesses described scenes that still defy comprehension. Of her grabbing infants by the leg and throwing them onto trucks bound for the gas chambers, of beating women until they released their children, of striking crying toddlers until they fell silent, of beating a 5-year-old boy until he stopped moving and then kicking his small body aside as if it were trash, all while smiling, all while repeating the same words, "This is a death camp." And as the war turned against Germany, as defeats mounted at Stalingrad and Sicily and beyond, Kochman did not slow down or soften, she became more vicious. Because the SS response to impending defeat was not restraint but acceleration, and in November 1943, during Operation Harvest Festival, the largest single-day massacre of Jews in the Holocaust, approximately 42,000 people were shot across 3 camps, including Majdanek, where 18,000 were murdered in a single day, and Kochman was there, part of the machinery of death, and when the Soviets approached in 1944 and the SS fled, destroying what evidence they could, Majdanek remained largely intact, becoming the first major concentration camp liberated by Allied forces, its gas chambers standing, its crematoria filled with ashes, its documents and structures preserved as undeniable proof. And while the world saw these images and struggled to comprehend them, Elsa Kochman tried to disappear, transferring between camps, shedding responsibility, hoping anonymity would save her. But survivors remembered, and names, faces, reputations were collected, and in late 1945, she was arrested, extradited to Poland, and brought back to Lublin to face judgment just miles from where she had committed her crimes. And as her trial began, survivors filled the courtroom, staring at a woman who now looked small and frightened, a woman who claimed she had no choice, that she was following orders, that she never personally killed anyone, and one by one, witnesses dismantled that lie, describing beatings, selections, murders. Cruelty carried out not under duress but with enthusiasm, and as the court listened, it became impossible to deny the truth that Elsa Kochman was not a passive participant but an active perpetrator. And as you continue listening to this story, remember that history is not only shaped by leaders and armies but by ordinary people who choose. And if you want to stay with us as we uncover how justice finally caught up with her and what her story teaches us about accountability and human nature, make sure you are subscribed. Because these are stories that matter, and they are far too important to forget. When the verdict was finally announced in December 1945, the courtroom in Lublin fell silent as the weight of history settled on a single name, and when the judge declared Elsa Kochman guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced her to death by hanging, the woman who had once terrorized thousands collapsed, sobbing, unable to stand on her own, carried from the room in a state of shock. And in the months that followed she wrote letters begging for clemency, claiming religious awakening, claiming remorse, claiming she was no longer the person described by witnesses, yet the appeals were denied, because mercy, like innocence, had long since been forfeited, and according to prison officials, something changed in her final weeks, as if the certainty she once wielded so casually had begun to crack, and she stopped insisting she was blameless, stopped repeating the language of orders and duty, and instead spoke of nightmares, of faces that would not leave her, of children she had beaten, of mothers screaming as their babies were torn away, and whether this was genuine remorse or simply the terror of facing death remains unknowable, because the line between fear and repentance is thin when the rope is already waiting, and one guard later recalled her asking, "Do you think God will forgive me?" A question that hung in the air unanswered, because what answer could possibly exist for someone who had turned suffering into entertainment? And on July 4, 1946, at the age of 30, Elsa Kochman walked to the gallows and was executed, her life ending in less than a minute, a stark contrast to the years of agony she had inflicted on others. And her death was not unique, because she was one of several female concentration camp guards executed for their crimes, including Irma Gries and Maria Mandel, yet her case shattered a comforting myth that had persisted for decades. The idea that women in the camp system were merely coerced helpers or reluctant participants, when in truth, the historical record shows that the vast majority of female guards were volunteers, and while not all embraced cruelty, many did, and some, like Kochman, exceeded their male counterparts in brutality, and out of the estimated 3,500 women who served as guards, fewer than 200 were ever tried, meaning most vanished into postwar Germany, assumed new identities, raised families, and lived out their lives untouched by justice, while survivors carried memories that never faded, and among them was Dr. Stefania Przanowska, who survived the war, testified at multiple trials, and dedicated her life to documenting Nazi crimes against medical ethics, keeping the promise she had made in the camp, that the world would know. And today, Majdanek stands as a museum and memorial, its gas chambers and crematoria still visible, its grounds silent but heavy with meaning, and visitors can walk the same paths where selections took place, where children were torn from mothers, where Elsa Kochman once stood and decided who would live and who would die, and her story endures not because she was unique, but because she was ordinary. Because evil did not arrive in the form of a monster from birth, it arrived in the form of a volunteer, someone who smiled. Someone who found opportunity in uniform, someone who discovered that when a system rewards cruelty, cruelty can become intoxicating, and the lesson of her life is not about the past alone, it is about the dangers of dehumanization, obedience without conscience, and the ease with which ordinary people can become instruments of horror when given power without accountability. And if there is value in revisiting stories like this, it is not to dwell on darkness, but to understand it, because memory is one of the few defenses history gives us, and by remembering what happened at Majdanek and who made it happen, we resist the lie that such things are impossible or unrepeatable. And if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and shared, staying connected with this channel helps keep them alive, because every story told is one more barrier against forgetting, and forgetting has always been the first ally of evil.